So could I turn to Lord Clement Jones first?
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Good morning. I'm going to start off with a very broad, general question to start with. What do you see as the greatest possible benefits and most pressing concerns associated with autonomous weapon systems, which no doubt we will shorten to AWS throughout our discussion today? Can I start with you, Charlie?
Certainly. So first, I'd like to thank the committee very much for having me here as a witness. I'll keep my remarks as short as possible to allow as many questions as possible. I represent the Office for Disarmament Affairs, so naturally our focus is more on the concerns presented by military use of AI, including AWS. And while it has been argued that there could be improvements in accuracy or reductions in collateral damage, this has not yet been demonstrated, and I would instead point to the potential impacts that verge more on the concern side. So some of these include things like AI applications in the military domain may lead to international instability. They have the potential for introducing elements of unpredictability at times of international tension, and they can lead to actions that are difficult to attribute. And I think difficulty of attribution is an element that is likely to come up frequently today. Creating risks for misunderstanding and unintended escalation, which I think you can also agree is a serious concern. AI technologies do have the potential that they could aid decision makers by allowing faster real-time analysis of systems and data and providing enhanced situational awareness. However, this presents its own concerns. It may compress the decision-making timeframe and also lead to increased tensions, miscommunication, and misunderstanding, including, particularly for my office's concern, between nuclear weapon states, which introduces another dynamic that we would be significantly concerned about. All uses of AI in military context present concerns regarding predictability, and the black box nature of the technology makes this particularly relevant for AWS. So one element I would especially like to underline is the importance of effective testing, evaluation, verification, and validation in this context, and demonstrable reliability. All of these are essential before deployment, and while there is a general acceptance among civil and military responsible development practices that AI should be robust, by which we obviously mean reliable and safe from a technical standpoint, the necessary testing, evaluation, verification, and validation to ensure this is a particular challenge for AI-related technologies in a military context, and especially for AWS. So how could we actually ensure that any testing we carried out did sufficiently meet those criteria? This is both because it is not currently clear that there are any proven effective methods for testing non-deterministic, by this I mean less predictable and more adaptable systems, like one would hope AWS would be, where runs of the same test may not generate the same results. And the differences between the testing environment and the deployment environment can cause unpredictable outcomes. Once deployed, changes in the data or in the algorithms themselves can also lead to changes in behavior, presenting still further challenges. I'll finish my remarks on this with just one quick more point, which is there is also the broader issue that some AI-related technologies are relatively easily acquirable by non-state actors, and so may be employed in weapons or non-weapon related functions. Such actors may not have the interest or even the capacity, if they did have the interest, to employ AI-related technologies in a responsible manner. And from our perspective, that particularly includes protections for civilians.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come back later to tease out whether it's essentially the autonomy or the intelligence that's the issue. Sure. I'm going to come to Yasmin next. That was quite a catalogue, Yasmin. Do you agree with that?
Yes, so I think that I would echo a lot of the points that Charlie made. So first of all, before we get into the opportunities and risks, I think that we need to also bear in mind that we need to broaden the scope a little bit beyond autonomous weapon systems. Because beyond autonomy as a function, I think that we also need to look at artificial intelligence, which is in line with the committee's mandate here today. And beyond weapon systems, I think that we also need to think about AI-enabled programs beyond weapon systems, such as software, for example, to enable strategic decision-making, and also those used across the targeting cycle for intelligence collection and making, for example. And in terms of the key benefits, I think that there's four that I would list, but then obviously with the caveat that the program works as intended. So first, there's the increased situational awareness, as Charlie has mentioned. So we can have, for example, software combining both data gathered live from the battlefield, combined with historical data, and also combined with success parameters, it will not only increase situational awareness, but also increase chances of mission success. And then the second, better intelligence collection, again with the caveat that it all works as intended and reliably. Third, there's the question of modeling. You can use AI-enabled software for advanced synthetic environment programs, enabling advanced wargaming. We have in the UK, for example, Improbable Defense that does a lot of work in this field that would enable better training and planning capabilities. And then fourth, the main sort of advantage, I would say, is speed, especially for time-sensitive decision-making processes, especially in the nuclear realm. But then again, you have all the risks associated that Charlie has mentioned. And again, at the risk of sounding a bit repetitive, I think that there's a question of the risks and the assumption that the AI is working as intended. So in terms of the risk, I would outline four. First is risk pertaining to the overhype and problematic and misleading assumptions around AI. We talk about artificial intelligence. So we have this intelligence, this construct that is inherently based on a human trait. But is it intelligent? And then I think that linked to that, there's the issue of risk perception and how it affects the way we evaluate risks. Especially now with the AI arms race dynamic, not only just in the security and defense sector, but also in commercial context. We can see here, for example, with big tech companies such as Google and Microsoft deploying AI technologies that perhaps might be premature in terms of testing and reliability evaluation at the expense of robust and thorough safety standards just for the sake of commercial gain. And then there's the issue of compliance with the law and ethics, which I think we'll cover a bit more in detail later in the hearing. Third is the integration of the systems within established command, control, and communication systems. And coupled with that, there's the issue of technical literacy of the users of such advanced systems. And then fourth are the technical issues that are more general, that may affect the reliability of the system. So for example, algorithmic bias, black box, the quality of training and testing data sets. And from this issue, naturally, you would think of ethical and legal and policy issues that we'll cover later on in this hearing.
So I think one of the interesting areas that you covered there was the perception point. Apart from the reality, there is this issue about the perception of AWS as well, which is added to all the concerns that Charlie mentioned. I'm going to come to you, Vincent, now. Do you agree broadly with those benefits and risks?
Thank you so much, and first of all, thank you for the opportunity to give evidence. I would generally totally agree to what Charlie and Yasmin said. I took the question very literally, so I'm going to focus mainly on the specific case of autonomous weapons, while I agree that it's also important to consider the military use of AI in general. So I guess I would like to start with just a brief caveat and say that the answer to your question, the original question about benefit and risk, depends partly on how one defines autonomous weapons. And as you may know, there's a lot of definitions out there. The working definition that we use at CIPRI recognize that what makes AWS so distinct and unique...
Sorry to interrupt, we're definitely going to come to that after this set of questions on the risk and benefit and so on. That's almost the next set of questions.
Sure. But I just want to flag that one element that is critical for that question is the fact that it's in weapons that once activated can select and apply force without human intervention. That's all the benefits and risk in a way stem from that very defining characteristic. The fact that part of the targeting process is at least part of it done by the machine. So in terms of benefit, when you talk to military planners, they would typically highlight 5. It would allow you for greater speed. You could execute target tasks much faster than if it was like a human operated weapon, and it's very potentially useful for like very time critical tasks like air defense or air-to-air combat where human reaction time might be too slow. That's one. 2, it allows you with greater reach. So you can basically deploy an AWS in an operational theater where that is beyond reach because either it's communication denied, so you cannot go there with remote control weapons, or it's too dangerous for a fighter aircraft to go, for instance. That's 2. 3, it can provide you greater persistence. So the classic argument that AWS performance is not altered by things like fatigue, boredom, hunger, or fear. So in a way, like they could, the performance would remain the same over time, and which make them very good for like missions that are very dull or dirty or dangerous. Like when you have to kind of defend a specific perimeter over a long time or track target over weeks or months. Fourth, great precision. The idea that potentially like autonomous weapons might be more effective and discriminated than if you are using artillery shells that are unguided. And the fact that potentially they can aim more precisely, allow you to also reduce the payload, so that also could reduce the risk of collateral damage. And five, the idea that it could allow you to reintroduce better coordination and math on the battlefield. So this idea that when autonomous weapons can operate as a team, as a football team, basically they can operate in a much more coordinated way than if they were all kind of human operated, and that arguably would allow militaries to reintroduce math on the battlefield, where you can have a large numbers of small autonomous weapons overwhelming air defenses, for instance. So these are like typically the benefits now highlighted by military experts. Then in terms of concern, I think most of my colleagues already covered them. I would just pack them in two categories. The first one are the humanitarian concerns and the fear that AWS, depending on how they are designed and how they are used, could expose civilians and protected people on the IHL to greater risk. And here the fear is that the systems, for instance, would not be reliable enough, or they would fail in a way that would expose civilians, like it would misidentify a civilian as a lawful target, for instance, or that the system would not be able to recognize people that are hors de combat, who are protected under IHL. But there are also people that have this kind of ethical perspective and say that, well, that's disputed, but have this view that it would be morally wrong to have an autonomous weapons to identify military personnel on the battlefield, that it would be a violation of the combatant's right to dignity. And but that point is highly contested in the policy discussion. So that's for the humanitarian concern. And then the second package, I would say, relates to the more strategic level concern. I think these have already been covered quite a lot by Yasmin and Charlie. I would perhaps add the idea that it could lower the threshold of arms conflict, and some states might be incentivized to perhaps conduct operations that could lead to an arms conflict because they feel like since it's a robotic system, the attribution would be harder. But I would point here that it's not AWS specific problem; it's basically a problem about robots in general. Then the other two key things are the impact on the speed of warfare, and I think Charlie already covered that point. That that's the downside of having something that allows you with faster reaction time, and the risk of use by non-state actors. And I think the idea of this kind of like low-tech autonomous weapons that could be kind of like developed by a terrorist group or people that are just putting together technologies from the commercial sector is clearly something that needs to be considered. Over.
Just before Lord Clement Jones goes on, can I bring in Lord Hamilton, who's got a point on these issues?
Well, I wanted to bring back the whole issue of Elon Musk yesterday, I think, saying that he thought that AI should be paused. I'd really like your views on the viability of pausing the development of AI, and how would you get international agreement that had any sort of viability in it at all? Charlie, perhaps.
Yes. That's not an easy one to volunteer to answer. So, Charlie, do you want to go first?
Certainly. It isn't an easy one to answer. And I think the call from Elon Musk and some of the other co-signatories is specifically relating to functions around ChatGPT and similar systems. I think possibly the best answer I can give here is to give one that is almost an advertisement for the UN and our general calls in this area, which is this really underlines a few issues. One is the dual use nature of the technology. He's not calling for a pause necessary in military development of AI. He's calling for a pause that relates to private sector and general development of AI. The dual use nature of the technology means that these developments have potential military impacts, and they also have obviously civilian and economic impacts. The key issue from a UN perspective in making any kind of pause or any kind of international regulation viable is that it has to be universal. So the private sector origins and the relatively low bars to acquisition of AI applications, there's no real obstacle for anyone to work on the development of AI or for anyone to purchase the applications that come out of the development of AI, meaning that the only way to ensure effective governance is through arrangements that are universally applicable and that are developed through an inclusive process. And I think your question sort of underlines that, right? That even if you were able to get complete agreement from every state, it would need to be a process that meaningfully engaged the private sector, civil society, academia, a huge range of stakeholders to have any meaningful impact. So if you take that to the narrower AWS context, then we're looking at what kind of international regulation is possible, who would have to be consulted, and who would actually have to be party to some kind of agreement there. And I'll end my remarks quickly there just to point also to the issue flagged also by Vincent, which is this issue of non-state actors. So you would have to have a situation in which non-state actors' accessibility or ability to use these kinds of technologies are also meaningfully restricted, which is where the dual use element becomes particularly important, because in general, the concern for non-state actors is diversion and misuse, but that they're using civilian technologies, not necessarily technologies designed with a military intent.
And Vincent and Yasmin, are you broadly in agreement with that?
Yes, so...
Yes.
Sorry.
Yasmin.
Okay. So I think that I would agree with the points that Charlie made, and I think the letter that came out yesterday was really timely in the light of our discussions today. It's just that I have a few concerns relating to the letter, because first of all, I think that, you know, it's commendable that they have set up these really ambitious objectives into what they're trying to achieve within the 6 months moratorium that they're calling for. They are asking for safety protocols and standards, and also a rethink on the risks associated with AI technologies. But I think that, first of all, 6 months is definitely not enough. You have ethicists, lawyers, civil society, academics, and even parliamentarians thinking about this for years now, and we haven't come up with a solution. So how do you expect to come up with robust safety protocols and standards within 6 months when for years people who have dedicated their professional life and time for that have not come up with a solution? But I think that what is interesting from the letter, and one lesson that we could learn, is the value of slow AI compared to the arms race dynamics that we're seeing at the moment. I am working on AI and I have a hard time keeping up with the news. I see ChatGPT, GPT-4, BART being developed in the large language models realm, and I can't keep up. So, you know, I think the value of slow AI is that I would allow us for more robust and thorough testing, evaluation, verification, and validation processes that would enable the incorporation of ethical and legal standards within the development of the systems. And something that I think would also be valuable from this sort of slower approach to developing and deploying AI is that it would allow space for an inclusive and multi-stakeholder dialogue that would inform the development of these AI-enabled technologies. Because in the end, those technologies are really powerful, and fact is, to develop and to conduct research for advanced AI at least, it requires a lot of, you know, when you think about AI, we talk about non-state actors, we think about anyone who could do AI research. Yes, of course, anyone can do AI research and work on their computer, but at the same time, if you want to run something that is highly advanced, you need high compute powers, you need hardware, you need a lot of resources, whether it's financial, human resources, and not everyone has it. Only a handful of companies have access to this kind of facilities, and I think that from slow AI, what the value is that we can also rethink of the power relationship we have vis-a-vis those powerful companies that have the power to conduct this powerful AI research.
But isn't that precisely the problem? I mean, slow AI sounds a lovely opportunity. We can all look around and we can assess the situation as it develops. But the people who are developing AI and are putting huge resources behind it, it's not in their interests to slow it up. So that slow AI has just really got to remain a bit of, it's pie in the sky, isn't it?
I mean, you know, the thing is that you can't, of course, slow AI might not be in their commercial interest, But if we think of ethical and legal requirements, it's also not in their interest for reputational purposes, but also for liability purposes to develop something that further down the line have such huge risk implications that it might actually hold them criminally liable for because for example, they didn't take into account the due diligence measures they had to take to go through for
Yes,
deploying
but
the systems.
if you can inject that into the bottom line, that's what commercial developers are keen on. If the possibility of criminal sanctions or reputational damage is something that they can see an economic implication for, then that might be a lot more persuasive. But I don't see the two joining up somehow.
I think that's where regulation could step in, really. And we have this kind of multi-stakeholder discussions here, for example, today in this committee, but also elsewhere. And I think if we have a think more closely with this actors from the private sector and also from the lawmaking community, from the policymaking community, and then from the civil society organization side, I think there would be really big value in sort of instilling this thinking, this culture of responsible AI into the minds of those developing those powerful AI technologies.
On the floor now.
Thank you. Vincent, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief since my colleague already covered quite a lot. I'll say about 3 points. Obviously, the first point is about, AI as a category is not really helpful. So it's so broad and so vague that it's difficult to define what is the contour of that sector. In a sense, there are so many technologies that we may fall under that definition. So I think it's always important to be specific about the type of application or end use that we are concerned with. And as my colleagues mentioned, like the idea that was discussed in the open letter was about these large language models like ChatGPT and so on. That's a very specific application. That's point number one. Number two, I think, is the difference between innovation in the civilian sector and the military sector. And I think to connect back to this idea of slow AI, the military sector is in a way a slow sector to the extent that there are legal mechanisms that slow down the adoption, or that they require that if a state wants to acquire AI for whatever military purposes, for instance, it needs to go through a legal review process where it will be, ensure that the system is not prohibited under international law and so on. So there are, like, in a way, safety mechanism baked in the acquisition process that minimize the risk. While when you get into the civilian sector, where regulations then is there's no international regulations, all from the civilian side, it's more the national or regional level, as we see now with the discussion in the EU about the EU AI Act. And I think one also difference is that in the civilian sector, commercial actors have an incentive to come to market very quickly. So while in the military sector, you are very mindful of the possible risk of, the system failing, for instance, while in the civilian sector, like, you have it's in your advantage to come out soon and to test the system and maybe have a system which is not. And that's the challenge, I guess. And perhaps the third point, the final point, is about how do we deal with that and whether a moratorium can be a solution. It could to some extent, but there are obviously challenges with that, as Yasmin mentioned. I guess one thing that may be helpful to think for the regulation is the idea that having a technology-centric approach might not be always helpful, and rather than to focus on norms around what are elements that needs to be considered for the responsible development and use of these technologies, like general high-level principles that companies would need to kind of abide by as they are developing and deploying these technologies. And I think that's a more kind of future-proof way of approaching this challenge, rather than saying that we need to kind of isolate this specific technology and determine whether we can keep working on it or not. Try to define this high-level principle, and then from there having this kind of a checklist where before you deploy, do we meet the criteria we have defined?
Thank you very much. As we've got into this area of the private sector and commercial pressures for development, I'm going to bring in Baroness Ducey, who wants to explore this in a bit more detail, and then I'll follow up with Lord Grocott, if that's
Okay, I'm interested to know, what do you consider to be the role of the private sector in driving development of AWS and shaping norms around their development and deployment? How do you think the government can encourage responsible innovation by the private sector? Could we start with you, please, Vincent?
Thanks. So I think I'm going to follow on my previous point in a sense where there's a difference between actors in the civilian sector and military sector. So when we talk about the private sector, it's important to be specific whether we're talking about defense companies or civilian companies that mainly operate on the civilian market. Typically, like the way technology is developed is when we talk about weapon technologies, they are developed by defense companies. So like companies that are pure players on the defense market, that have established kind of relationship with the defense ministries, and they are generally aware of the requirement that the government place in terms of safety, in terms of but also need to kind of develop systems that can be used in compliance with the law and so on. But the challenge is that now a lot of the innovation is coming from the civilian side, and we see a trend where now governments are also considering approaching civilian companies because they are leading innovation in many areas. So I think that's a kind of a novel dynamic, right? So in a way, like what we see is a model where innovation is being pulled by the civilian sector, and now the military sector is trying to kind of find a way to kind of adopt these civilian developments in a way that is helpful for military purposes. On there are a lot of challenges for the military, including like how do we ensure that what works in the civilian actually also work in the military context, and then you end up facing a very practical problems like you can't train the system with the same type of data in the civilian sector than in the military sector, where for obvious security reasons, like you want to, you need different type of data. You need to be sure that the data is properly selected and so on. So the safety and security standards are much higher, and then that's a practical hurdle to importing the technology in the military sector. But that being said, it also depends on the actors. So some actors maybe that state that are responsible will do what it takes to ensure that when they are importing technologies from the civilian sector, that the technology is imported in a way that is responsible, so that they have properly tested it, maybe modified it in a way so that it can be used lawfully and safely and so on, that it's certified for use and that the user will be trained and so on. But there's also the risk that some actors are irresponsible and don't see a need to be responsible, and rather see the benefit of using that technology is greater than using it safely. And that's a challenge where when we talk about non-state actors or potentially some states that just for strategic reasons don't see a need to adopt the technology in a responsible way. And that's a race to bottom in terms of safety that is potentially a challenge.
Thank you. Charlie, have you got anything to add? And could you just also tell me if you feel that the military are putting sufficient resources behind AI, and in particular AWS?
Sure. Well, I'll start by just agreeing with Vincent. I think he raised a number of very, very important points there. To deal with the first part of the question, I think it's also very important to recognize that essentially all of the leading cutting edge development in the AI sector is coming from the private sector or coming from academia. So this is where the dual use nature becomes incredibly important. I hope we do get an opportunity to really dig into the TEVV, the training, evaluation, verification, and validation issue. Also flag that very briefly, but I think that might be deserving of a question area of its own. So it is important to recognize also that the nature of modern development often compartmentalizes the engineers who are involved and can make it very difficult for them to follow the second and third order consequences of the decisions made in development. And the reason I flag that is because, as Vincent said, this is effectively a relatively novel dynamic. And it means that not only are we having a situation where technologies are being developed in the civilian environment that may then be used in a military context, including AWS, but decisions made by people at relatively junior levels in private sector organizations can have significant second and third order impact. So some of that can be to do with things like the training data in question, but some of it can also be to do with the parameters involved in selecting something. So we do have to be aware of what the longer or larger impacts of those decisions can be. This is part of why norm generation and the development of norms is incredibly important. So just to finish very quickly on that first point on the private sector and the government's role, I think this is an area that really does need to be underlined. There are a number of civilian-focused responsible AI efforts that I'm sure you're already familiar with that tend to deal with issues like algorithmic bias, and they tend to look at things in a justice context or similar, but they tend to have primarily a civilian focus. What are the civilian sector impacts of those decisions? What are the civilian sector impacts of algorithmic bias? Which means they don't necessarily respond to peace and security challenges, which can be related, but can be significantly different or can have significantly more serious impacts. So the question is also, how do we expand responsible innovation to cover peace and security? This is an area where government encouragement could be really helpful, as the government is also the source for the development of so much good practice and norms around responsible development and deployment practices in general. For those of us who use systems like Prince2, which correct me if I'm wrong, I understand was developed by the British government, these are models that become standard good practice without necessarily having any formal international regulation around them. Just to give a very brief answer on your question about military devotion of resources to responsible generation. Obviously, from a UN perspective, I can't speak specifically to the British military or the situation in general. There are steps that seem useful. There are ones like the DoD principles from last year. In the US context, there's things that are developed by NIST, which is the standards framework organization in the US as well, that are all relevant for both civil and military contexts. It's very difficult to say what would be sufficient in this kind of case. So certainly it's something that military seem to be paying attention to, but I think it's also important to underline the point Vincent alluded to about the legal requirements, and I'm sure we'll get to this later. But things like Article 36 weapon reviews require a certain standard or require a certain process to be gone through before something could be legally deployed and used. And I think that's a key area to look at as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yasmin.
Yeah, so there's a lot of dimensions to these questions, and first I'd like to echo the points that Charlie and Vincent both made on the dual-use nature of technologies. I think that beyond the sort of classical technologies that you would instinctively think they have dual-use nature, for example, facial recognition technologies, we have to even go beyond looking at these technologies. So one example is, some time ago, I think it was a few months ago or even just a year ago, there was an organization, Bellingcat, that found information on US nuclear weapons stationed in Europe through database from an application on mobile phones for flashcards. And the thing is that it's because staff and military bases were using this app to memorize information without really realizing that their input about these nuclear weapon systems would go public into the database of this app. And the thing is that we saw recently, I think it was last week, the ChatGPT, the chatbot application, they have established plugins where you can basically train the system to databases on the internet. So technically, if we think about ChatGPT being plugged into the database of this flashcards app, you can actually ask this ChatGPT, can you tell me where the nuclear weapons are in Europe? Can you tell me some specificities about it? And you have a lot of security implications around this kind of blurring between civilian applications of AI and military applications. And then second, on the question of shaping norms, we have to be careful about the language that we're using, because if we go from the basis that norms are international law rules, public international law is fundamentally made by states and for states. Does the private sector have influence on this on the shaping of international law? Probably. That's undeniable, even like in terms of the standards, in terms of the non-binding instruments, in terms of the technological progress that influences the way the law is shaped. But the thing is that even beyond the military sector, we can look, for example, in the US, where you have a set of soft law, but even if they're negotiating bills and acts that would be binding, they would be more prone to a self-regulatory approach where basically companies are left to themselves to basically marking their own homeworks, and they have their own responsibility to respect the law. Whereas in the EU, it's much more generalist, it's more prescriptive, and it's more a risk-based approach. Where does the UK stand there? I think that that's something that we could discuss in more detail later on. And but the thing is that essentially we need to be careful, because in the end, public international law, international humanitarian law, those are all state-centric. And even if we have individual responsibility in the criminal law realm, And even if we think about domestic responsibility and liability of these technologies, we have to make sure that when we shape international norms, if we do around AI in weapon systems, we have to take into account state responsibility. And in terms of push for responsibility...
Sorry to interrupt you, but there's a mismatch appearing here, isn't there? Because obviously international humanitarian law needs to be enforced on an international basis and developed on an international basis. But there's also a role for individual governments being able to create a regulatory environment and enforce it. Now, the extent to which they can enforce it, of course, is an open question. But there is a role there for individual governments operating independently.
Of course, yeah, and that's actually where, you know, the thing is, even though you have this sort of mismatch, as you said, the thing is, states have a responsibility for you know, bodies such as the military acting on their behalf to respect the law, because otherwise they could be held liable for violations of international law. Just a quick point on the push for responsible innovation. There's two things that I think I would like to point out. First is there's space here for the government to encourage an anticipatory approach to governance, so focusing on the upstream stages of the life cycle of the technology so that they would be compliant with legal and ethical norms by design. I think that that's one approach to push for responsible development of AI. And second is we need to acknowledge the experimental nature of AI and the risks associated with this experimental nature. So we have to think of incentives and also effective approaches to take into account this experimental nature. I think that one analogy that at Chatham House we're currently exploring for AI is the approach that the US Food and Drug Administration are adopting for products related to food and drug safety. So that would be based on the phased and gradual rollout of products. And then even after the sort of release of the product in the public, then you have constant auditing to look at the direct and the side effects of this product, so that you can make sure that if things start to go wrong, and that you can see from the experimental release of this product, then you can potentially phase it out if you see that doesn't.
Can we pause that there? Vera Susi, do you need to come back on that?
No, I'll come back later.
Right. Lord Fairfax, and then I'll come to Lord Grocott.
Thank you very much. In view of all the considerations that all three of you have outlined this morning, is it your view that an AI arms race is realistically inevitable?
Yasmin, you've been sketching out for us a sort of Panglossian approach to this. It'll all be all right in the end. I'm not sure how many supporters you have around the table, but what's your view on an arms race?
I think that, you know, the problem is that we have this hype around AI, and coming back to the commercial civilian sector, you have this arms race dynamic and this sort of urge to innovate and to deploy technologies to have a sort of cutting edge advantage. And in the military sphere, I don't think that we're spared from this dynamic, in the sense that, for example, you can see in Ukraine, there is the deployment of technologies reportedly from Palantir and Clearview that are based on AI. And the thing is that these are highly experimental technologies, and I don't doubt that whether it's like-minded states or even adversaries, they might want to deploy similar technologies for in the battlefield as a response to this sort of deployment of AI in the battlefield now. So, you know, the thing is, I wouldn't say it's inevitable in the sense that, yeah, I mean, I'm quite skeptical in the sense that we can refrain ourselves from an arms race dynamic, but I think that if we adopt a careful approach, whether it's through regulatory measures or even through soft law and policy documents, I think that there is room to refrain ourselves from being carried over by the hype and to
So
really
at the
come
moment you're a cautious pessimist.
Yeah, exactly.
Is Vincent also a cautious pessimist?
Thanks. I mean, on that question, I mean, we looked in that topic a while back for a report, and I don't personally don't like so much the concept. I mean, it's very catchy and it's normal people use it, but the idea of it's a misnomer to say AI arms race in a sense. We try to introduce this idea like it's an AI capability race in a sense. The race is about global major military powers have see the value of AI for future military capabilities. So I guess, but they understood that where the race is at the level of the building blocks, data. So to ensure that you collect and you are able to kind of develop the data to train very advanced AI systems. That's one point. Two, the talent. So also being able to train enough people to actually develop AI application, be it for civilian or military application. And third, they also access to kind of the hardware component. So this whole idea of like you need some semiconductors that are designed specifically, for instance, for machine learning. And then where we see that in the way that capability race playing out then is around, for instance, the old discussion about export control, where the US and other countries see the need to kind of place some restrictions on specific technologies that would limit the ability of China, for instance, to keep up in the kind of capability race around AI. So this idea of like trying to slow down competitors by preventing them access to the key technologies and so on. And we also see move around this idea of like preventing other countries or other actors to access data and so on. So I think that's where we see potentially like a competition going on around like these components for developing advanced AI. And the second point in terms of the risk around this kind of capability race, I think, and I flagged that before, is the prospect of having a race to the bottom, where some actors, because they want to be able to kind of like embrace the benefits of AI for military capabilities, will disregard norms around HR compliance or safety and decide to deploy AI-based systems that are unsafe, not properly designed, and then that could, if used in armed conflict, could expose civilians to harm or increase the risk of escalation and so on. So I think that's the kind of the real kind of security concern around that competition, that some actors will just adopt it irresponsibly just because they feel the urge to kind of keep up.
I think we all recognise that arms race is a rather lazy shorthand, but that it the phenomenon shares a lot of characteristics with arms races as we have come to observe them. Charlie, you're in the business, I would guess, of trying to make us a bit more optimistic about these issues. Do you want to reassure us, as it were? Fairly briefly, I've got my eye on the clock and we've still got quite a lot of ground to cover.
I'll be as reassuring as I possibly can be, and I would take that perspective that, look, we have had arms races and security dilemma situations before that we have avoided as a planet and that we have been able to step back from. So I wouldn't call it inevitable in that sense. I do completely agree with the points that Yasmin and Vincent raised, and I think an important thing to underline, and again, getting back to the dual use nature of the technology and this idea of having arms race potential dynamics in the building of capacity, is that even given the nature of the technology, a capacity that is scrupulously civilian may be perceived by neighbors as a kind of latent military capacity. So even if to some degree if we're talking about a focus that is exclusively developing a significant domestic AI capacity, it will have an impact. And one other area I'd just like to flag very briefly in there is also this issue of, to some degree, a kind of jurisdictional fragmentation. So the nature of the companies that we've mentioned before means that not necessarily all of those aspects are located within a single jurisdiction. Yeah. So whether we're talking about where the data is collected, where the servers are, those kinds of things. So given time, I'll hand back there.
And of course, jurisdiction shopping is always going to be an option for some conglomerates. Yeah, Lord Grocott, if I come to you, and then Lord Horton after that.
Yes, I wonder if to ask our witnesses to help the committee by giving us their how they would define autonomous weapons systems, because we've found a number of different attempts at that so far. And obviously the briefer the better. But shall we start with you, Charlie?
Sure. Well, this will be a difficult one to be brief on, but I can give a quick summary, which is especially from the perspective of my office, because we provide the substantive support to the group of governmental experts in this area, the GG that I'm sure you're familiar with. There isn't an internationally agreed definition. So there are debates around the extent to which a definition is useful, and there's different calls for proposals around characterizations, or whether an internationally agreed definition is even needed, or whether characterization is better. One of the general points of convergence does seem to be that a definition, characterization, or description should be technology neutral. And I think we've mentioned this briefly before, so that it can adequately cover all future types of weapons or weapon systems. So something that describes the functions and capacities of weapons or the weapon system and centers around the elements of autonomy, human control, which I'm sure we'll get to again soon, and terms which are really at the core of what we're actually talking about when we debate, because the technological or technical definition maybe is not necessarily completely required or useful. I think a good illustration is that the NPT, for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as far as I'm aware, doesn't discretely define what a nuclear weapon is, because it doesn't necessarily need to. So on this point, the GG has already been relatively clear that human responsibility for decisions on the use of weapon systems must be retained, because it cannot be transferred to machines. And these kinds of elements are useful definitionally. I think it's also probably worth recognizing that a rigid definition, even at a domestic level, that may later become an obstacle to joining an international instrument, may also not be advisable. I'll probably just finish by also taking a step back further and noting that definitions of AI and autonomy, as I'm sure the committee has found, are also not universally accepted in general. To some degree, AI can be a sort of moving goalpost. Committee members may be familiar with, not that long ago, if there was an AI that could reliably beat a human at chess, that would have been accepted as a meaningful definition of AI. In the current environment, that's effectively useless.
So,
Thank you. I'll try to be very brief, since I mentioned that before. The working definition that we use which in a way reflects a lot of the working definitions that are out there, recognize that what makes autonomous weapons unique is the fact that once activated, they can identify, select, and apply force to targets without human intervention. We think that's the most kind of productive working definition, and it's not to say that it's the definition that needs to be used for potential regulation. Definitions have a political component of it. So, but I guess for the kind of the legal or ethical or security analysis, I think these are the important elements. If I may, I can maybe add a few additional elements that are usually associated with, in terms of characteristic with autonomous weapons. I think it's good to remember that AWS can take all shape and form and be equipped with very different type of payloads and be used in very different type of missions and conflicts. So that's one of the challenges in the debate. Like, people think of different type of autonomous weapons. Some people think of high intensity type of drones that will, fight at machine speed. Others are thinking of more like counterinsurgency models where we are trying to kind of track down some terrorist group somewhere in a cave. Totally different application. But another characteristic which is, I think, important for the analysis is that it's a pre-programmed weapon, and what makes autonomous weapons different from other guided munition is the idea that you program the weapon to attack target types or category of targets rather than a specific human, specific design target. So say these categories of tanks rather than that specific tank in that specific location. And it means like that's a third characteristic, that it's a target activated weapon. So once in the environment, once that's recognized the type of target it's supposed to engage, it will engage automatically. The human doesn't need to press a button. That being said, fourth characteristic, the human may be in a supervisory role and keep the opportunity to override the system, but it doesn't need to kind of have, the system can really implement the targeting cycle automatically. That's so, just to say, the human can be in a supervisory role and it can still be an autonomous weapon, in my view. Over.
No, Greg.
What I try, so much of this is speculative, almost academic, these kind of discussions I'm finding. So you all have difficulties in defining AWS, or at least that seems to be a pretty consistent problem throughout the whole of these discussions. But what I'd like to, can you actually pinpoint, whatever, however you define it, could you please give me an example of an existing weapons system that either meets the definition that you've got or comes close to meeting it? I'd just like to get something I can get my hands on. Charlie, let's, well, it doesn't matter, Jasmine.
So I would not be able to provide a specific example of an AI autonomous weapon systems or an AI-enabled weapon system, but there is evidence that there are other military applications of AI-enabled systems used in the battlefield. For example, we have reports around the use of technology developed by Clearview, so it's a company, in Ukraine to identify dead bodies, and which is in line in principle with international humanitarian law sort of requirements to dispose of the dead. But then the thing is that it's based on facial recognition technologies, and that's established as an AI. But whether or not, I would not say it's a weapon system because then it's used for other functions. There are reports that Palantir are using AI-enabled technologies to help with targeting, to select targets in Ukraine.
I think
it's still very.
I think Lord Greycott's really after something very specific here. To point to a piece of hardware that fits into one category or not. I mean, we're very well aware of some of the developments you've described, but this seems to be the block in our route to understanding and appreciating exactly what we're talking about.
If I may come in here, I mean, there are a few historical examples of automated weapon systems, and according to the definition that we use, could also be described as autonomous weapon systems to the extent that once activated, it can select and engage target without human intervention. These are typically defensive weapon systems, and there are variations of them. So, for instance, you have the Phalanx closing weapon system, which is basically a system that you have on the ship, which can be turned into autonomous mode if there is like a oncoming, overwhelming attack. The system will just automatically identify incoming threats and try to neutralize them. So, be there like incoming missiles or incoming planes and so on. You have the same version also for like tanks. It's called active protective systems. Also, it's a system that you activate in autonomous mode, and if there are incoming threats to the tank, it will try to identify the munitions and neutralize them. That's for this type of defensive systems. They have been around for a very long time. They can also be in a mode where it's supervised, and the human may be in a mode where it's kind of semi-autonomous, when he would authorize the use of force, but it can be turned into a fully autonomous mode. The other type, more offensive type of weapons, the one that is closest to what people are actually concerned with, are what we call loitering munitions. So basically, it's a mix between a drone and a missile. And the idea is that you would have, like the Harpy that was developed in Israel in the 90s, but there have been other developments, over the last decades in similar systems under development. And the idea is that you send the drone over a specific area, and you have it loiter over that area to find the type of target that it's supposed to attack. And originally that was designed for suppression of enemy air defenses. So the Harpy, the one I mentioned, basically is supposed to kind of go find mobile radars. So the problem with the mobile radars is that you don't always know where they are. They are switched on, they emit for a limited period, and then they switch off. So the idea of having a loitering munition is that it can hover over that area, and as soon as it detects the radar, it then basically destroy on that radar. That has been around for a very long time. And now we see that potential development of loitering munitions that will also be used against other type of targets like tanks and so on. And there have been research projects that have tried to look at that for a long time. But an interesting anecdote is that when these systems were developed in the 90s originally, they were supposed to be fully autonomous, in the sense where once it's called fire and forget. Once it's sent, the system will just do the thing, you will not be able to remotely control it. But the new versions over time have been equipped with actually remote control, where the operator can keep the possibility to steer the system and abort the mission. So and I think it's an interesting development in the sense that we don't see necessarily like a trajectory toward more autonomy, but a system where militaries would still want to keep some control over the weapon, if possible.
I think we're moving very neatly into the area of human involvement, which I know is something Lord Horton wants to pursue.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for spending time with us this morning. Can I also ask you to be helpful to the committee here, not cautionary, but very positive in making some recommendations about human involvement? I say that because I don't think that the committee's problem is really anything to do with ethics or morality or compliance with IHL. I think we could probably all sit degree qualifications in them, the amount of evidence on those things that we're taking. Our problem is the challenge of how best to comply while still maximising all the benefits of AI that we know are out there, and which was, Vincent, you mentioned early on, those things that relate to cost, precision, no human military casualties potentially. So from my perspective, there are probably three routes to compliance, which certainly don't involve the creation of new law. One of them that you've mentioned is selective regulatory bans on the basis of legality or on the basis of the fact that these systems employ a black box technology which is not understandable by even the experts that develop it. The second route would be to place technical limits on the degree of autonomy on a fielded system so that at some point there was human involvement in the chain. And then the third, if you like, is any enhancements to what I would call battlefield regulations. Because after all, the battlefield is highly regulated already in respect to rules of engagement, targeting directives, command and control protocols. So the question really is about translating policy into operational reality. And to make this possible within the UK policy guidelines thus far, we have got to have appropriate human involvement or meaningful human control in relation to AWS. And could you give your own understanding of those terms and perhaps indicate some beneficial ways in which human involvement might be brought about? Can I start with Vincent?
Yeah, I'm happy to break the ice. Thank you for the question. I think I'll start with the first concept that you mentioned, like context-appropriate human involvement. So for me, this term recognizes two things. A, that for an attack with AWS, for it to be lawful, the human should be involved to determine and help ensure that the effect of that attack are not prohibited under international law, and are also compliant with the rules guiding the conduct of hostilities, and notably the principle of distinction and proportionality and precaution. But that formulation also recognizes that the way and the extent to which human needs to be involved may vary. That's the context element, right? Depending on contextual variables. So notably like the actual characteristic of the systems, how predictable it might be, how it recognizes the target, but also the characteristic of the environment. How predictable the environment is, are there civilians or civilian objects that are present, to what extent may civilians may pop up at some point during the operation also. So I think this is what that term is supposed to kind of like capture in practice. Now moving on to the concept of meaningful human control. So I guess you all know like the term was originally coined by civil society, notably a UK-based NGO called Article 36. And it had become a very popular term in the policy conversation because it kind of captured the idea that humans should keep agency over the decision to use force, and that their role should remain meaningful. And I think the point of adding that qualifier meaningful is that having humans just in a supervisory role might not be enough, notably because of problems like we know of like automation bias. So humans should in a way exercise some kind of an active role to ensure legal compliance, but also potentially ethical acceptability, but also ensuring that, the mission is actually efficient from a military perspective. But at the same time, it's also important to acknowledge that the term meaningful human control is a contested term in the policy conversation for a number of reasons. I think the key reason for, if I understand correctly, is that some actors are concerned that the word control could be interpreted in a very narrow way and be equated to this idea of actually active control over the weapon at all times. Because for some of these actors, this idea of this form of control is not appropriate, is not legally required, but also may be counterproductive in some contexts and might actually lead to more civilian casualties. So then, in terms of I don't know if you want me to elaborate on how this term could be basically exercised in practice, but when it comes to kind of exercising appropriate human involvement, based on the work that we have done, the idea is that the involvement, that means that the human should kind of try to exercise some form of judgment to determine whether in light of the characteristic environment, whether the effect, the system can be directed at the military objective, and that the effect will be compliant with the role distinction, proportionality, and also depending on different variables that the user may need to take precautionary measures. So, for instance, he could decide not to deploy that weapons because the risks are too high, or he could then try to use different type of control measures to kind of limit the effect and ensure that the effects are lawful. And there, I think our view is that it's important to see that under the notion of control, there are a lot of different possibilities. The first one is you can try to work with the weapon parameters in the design phase, for instance, by limiting the type of targets that the system can engage or how it may recognize the target. You can, at the moment of activation, you can also try to limit the scope of operation in terms of time and space. So not loitering for 3 hours, but only 10 minutes to reduce the risk of unpredictability, for instance. That's one type of control measures. Another type is the idea of having control over the environment. So you can directly try to structure the environment to minimize the risk of civilian casualties, for instance, where you issue warning or you put some fences to make clear that civilians should not be or accessing that area. That could be the case, for instance, if you are using no man's land area or if you're using autonomous weapon to protect a specific perimeter, like a base or something. And the third type of measures is the one obviously people are most focused on is this human-machine interaction types. And in some contexts, it might be needed for a human to remain in a supervisory role and keep the ability to intervene to minimize the risk of unintelligent engagement or disproportionate effects. So these are the basically three big categories that we identified in our work.
Okay, thank you. That's quite comprehensive. Charlie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Vincent has been pretty comprehensive as well. I think it's important to touch on that issue of the environment itself. So the example Vincent gave before of Phalanx is a relatively uncontroversial system because it's intended to be used at sea. So it's an environment where there shouldn't really be civilians present. I think it's important to recognize that it hasn't been demonstrated that any algorithm can reliably make the human-like decisions and judgments required to comply with international law. And that many states have argued that no weapon system using AI autonomy in its critical functions can perform those judgments in conformity with international humanitarian law. So from our side, the Secretary General has been pretty clear that he says machines with the power and discretion to take lives without human involvement are politically unacceptable, morally repugnant, and should be prohibited by international law. I'm sure you're already familiar with the line, and it's one that we use a lot. He was referring specifically to weapons that could be used to target and attack without any involvement, control, or oversight of a human operator. So Article 36 weapons reviews have come up again. I think this is an area that we certainly wish to explore further, and we would encourage states to share good practices in their weapons review processes in this context, and especially to support other states. But I think it's also important, just to add to what we've heard, is that it may also be useful to think what the implications for AWS are and other uses of military AI, what the implications are for their use in this context if their compliance cannot be satisfactorily assessed. So what would be the implications for use and regulation if you can't demonstrate that they can be used? So in addition to the points that Vincent has made, I think it's important to underline that.
Before I come to Yasmin, can you just be clear on that? you almost give the impression that there can be no human delegation to a fully autonomous system. But if that fully autonomous system has been tested and approved in such a way that it doesn't rely on a black box technology, but constant evaluation has proved that the risk of it non-complying with the parameters of international humanitarian law are accepted, that then there is a delegation effectively from a human to a machine, why is that not then compliant? Or why would you say that that should be prohibited?
So again, as I'm coming from a UN side, I would be deferring to member states for what the end decisions are for a total prohibition or what any kinds of international instruments were. But I think the key issue there is that that's a very big if. If it is possible to demonstrate all of those things, testing, evaluation, verification, and validation have come up for a good reason. That the environment of testing for civilian AI can be incredibly similar to the environment of deployment for civilian AI. For an autonomous weapons system, we have to think, what could the testing environment possibly be like that would make us, as in this case, your committee, make you satisfied that definitely the system would behave in that specific way when used in the environment of deployment. And I think when you talk about delegation, I think the issue there is also just accountability. So if those things were able to be demonstrated, if you were able to have a system that had no black box element, that was completely explainable, we could completely understand why the decisions were made, there still needs to be an element of human accountability. So it's that part that is the part that we would wish to underline. So,
and what I'm saying is that there still is
Sure.
human accountability, because a human has taken, ultimately a politician, a government minister, has delegated through a targeting directive the fact that he is content to delegate to this particular piece of autonomous machinery in certain circumstances that it can act on its own predetermined algorithms or whatever, so long as they're not a black box that nobody can understand.
So in that case, then the person making that decision would be legally responsible
Absolutely.
for the consequences of decisions.
As government ministers are all the time about the authorization of lethal force. It's one of their duties.
I think there's also a question there, and this will probably come up again in other sessions that you have, of how accountable that person can be to the extent that they understand or reasonably could be expected to understand the deviations that the system might make. So I think to go back to what I was saying before, the main issue there is that it's a very big if. How would we demonstrate all of those things? So how would we ensure that the politician in this case, or whether it was a military officer in other cases, is reasonably informed and could reasonably expect the system to behave in the way that it does, that then if it doesn't behave in the intended function, that person is still, it's reasonable to hold them accountable.
I'm tempted to observe that in this respect, sometimes the human being is probably as vulnerable to not getting it right as the machine. But anyway, that's a different set of answers. Let's go to Yasmin and then I'll give way to someone else.
Yes, so of course the thing is that there will be situations where human involvement, oversight, approval, control, or whatever term we're using, would be more desirable or even necessary for compliance with international law against like the technical capabilities and limitations of the technology that we're talking about. So for example, targeted engagement in areas with densely civilian population or with heightened risks of disproportionate civilian casualties. But then on the flip side of the coin, as you rightly pointed out, there are some situations that may require such speed that the cognitive limitations of human beings may actually constitute more of a liability for legal compliance. And the question is that accountability is not necessarily the question, in the sense that there will always be a human accountable. That's for sure. It's more a question of choosing the appropriate contexts in which there would be more benefits than risks of deploying AI that may have certain levels of human control or not. And in the end, it's a question of risk assessments and the calculation of risk versus opportunities, whether it's related to mission success, but also legal compliance and compliance with moral and ethics and policy. And one way of sort of working around this sort of the issue that Charlie mentioned about the reasonable expectation to understand how the technology works and the ability to operate human control when necessary is the question of the design stages of the technology. So when we conceptualize an AI system, we have to think, is it really worth doing delegating this kind of task to an AI, or is it more worth keeping it within the realm of human intervention? And if it's actually worth using AI, then we have to work around the technical parameters of the technology, but also the interface that is being used, because in the end, the end users might not have a computer science background, that might not have been involved in the coding and the design and the testing and evaluation stages of the technology. They're just being handed the technology, and one way to sort of ensure that they can exercise the human intervention or control in the appropriate context is to make sure that these interfaces are user-friendly and in a way that would enable them to be aligned with these legal norms. I was talking the other day with someone from a technology company specifically developing software for helping with targeting. And one of the solutions they found was, for example, to have the screen and then you have a pop-up that comes up and freezes all decision-making until a human operator would actually say yes or no, this is a lawful target. It's this kind of technical solutions and interface that I think would be helpful in terms of operationalizing this, the exercise of human control when appropriate.
Can I just ask, Chairman, this issue that keeps arising as to whether the technology does what it's intended to do, I mean, that's not specific to AI, is it? I mean, that's the characteristic. I mean, a bayonet either works or it doesn't work. I mean, if it bends when you're using it, it's not much use. And I mean, isn't that just an assumption when you look at any weapon or any weapon system?
Of course, I mean, if you look at, for example, offensive cyber capabilities, you're sort of going with the assumption that this capability will work as intended and will not, for example, go beyond the targeted systems that it is intended to be offensive against, or whether it's related to missile systems or missile technologies or other kind of technology, of course. And that's why I think AI is a lot about novel questions, but also old questions related to, for example, technical reliability.
Can we move on to a broader stage, perhaps? Bishop of Coventry.
Thank you, Lord Chair, and thank you very much to our witnesses. It's always fascinating to follow Lord Horton. My questions are sort of on the same theme, but of a much more amateur sort. I'm always fascinated to hear Lord Horton talk about commander responsibility and battlefield regulation. I suppose what I'm finding it quite difficult to get my mind round with AWS is, if I understand it right, an element of the definition is adaptability to the environment. As Yasmin said earlier, taking on board battlefield data. And therefore, I'm finding it very difficult to see how meaningful human involvement can be integrated into an evolving weapon system. How does the commander, who, and I may be mistaken, but picking up your comment a moment ago, Yasmin, may not have the technical expertise always that others would have at different stages of the development. How would that commander, in an evolving situation with an evolving weapon, be able to calibrate the right sort of human involvement? Would it change as the weapon changes? And if I may ask, and this is a sort of bigger supplementary, I suppose, one thing I think we've been, I've certainly been very interested in, and I think has been a regular theme, has been the sort of, we're not there yet theme, as it were, that the weaponry is simply not able, and I think, Vincent, you sort of referred to this a moment ago, that the weapon, or maybe was it Charlie, that the weaponry simply isn't at a point at which it can be trusted to meet the requirements of international law. But I'm also very conscious, as Yasmin said, of the speed at which it's developing. You said you can't keep up with it. My goodness, none of us can. And so I suppose I'm wondering how we handle that, and how policymakers and lawmakers and even and the military think forward to those situations that may not be as far away as we've been sort of assured they will be. So I suppose I'm thinking in terms of the reassuring sort of comments that our military of defence make, that yes, weapons that really are, autonomous and can make their own decisions and so on, we just don't want anything to do with them. I mean, in the sort of very advanced state. But we needn't worry about that because that's a long way off. Do we not have to be prepared for the long way off that might be nearer than when we first, than we might anticipate? So there's a very big question there. Maybe the first one, if you were able to focus on that, is in. But I think the second one relates to it as well. This whole question of self-evolving weapons and how human responsibility, what that means in that. And I think that does relate to the speed of development, because these things are changing so quickly, and the capacity to self-evolve, I guess, is increasing all the time. Thank you, and forgive a rather long set of questions. Vincent, it looks as if you're wanting to come in on that.
Thanks. I mean, you raise a number of very big and interesting questions. I guess one point that is important to keep in mind is related to the kind of notion of adaptability. I think sometimes we tend to kind of confuse the idea that the weapon maybe adapt to a dynamic situation and variations in the environment, and the ability to learn and to change its programming. So the first option might be fine as long as you can predict and have an idea of how the system may or not adapt to variations, for instance, like weather variations, or whether change in if there's a presence of civilians or not, and whether the system will be able to kind of trigger different type of response. In a way that can be pre-programmed and controlled in some way where you can still have some kind of predictability. You can predict the system will behave in a specific way, in a specific, if this happens, basically. But then when we are talking about the systems that would keep learning and taking in new data and rechanging their parameters of use during the use, then that would be problematic. And actually people would argue that this weapon would be inherently unlawful, because you would need to do a new legal review to verify that the learning has not affected the performance in a way that would make the effect indiscriminate by nature. So in a sense, that people would argue that if there is some learning, most likely that would be in the form of the system learned during the mission. After the mission, the information is uploaded and then retested and reassessed, and then the system can go. But it would have to go through some form of a screening process. Otherwise, that would be legally problematic, but also I'm foreseeing that commanders would find that they wouldn't want a system to use a system where they don't know how the system might behave, or might learn something that could lead the system to behave in a way that is unpredictable, and then either could lead to kind of civilian harm, or just a situation where it would be operationally just counterproductive. So these would be the main 2 points. And then perhaps just to add one last point, and just to go back to the IHL question, because I think it's an important element. I think growing understanding is that weapons, we should not anthropomorphize autonomous weapons. Weapons do not comply with the law. The law bites on states and their agents, human agents. So the responsibility to comply with IHL is with the states and the armed forces that decide to deploy weapons. So that in a sense, the evaluations demanded, for instance, by the principle of distinction and proportionality cannot be fully automated, in a sense that humans ultimately, or the agents of the states, needs to make these decisions. I think that's one of the interpretation that is, fairly shared by in the community of legal advisors. Over.
Thank you very much, Vincent. That's very helpful. And the whole concept of weapons review, I know Charlie has spoken about. I suppose I'm also interested, though, in whether, am I right in thinking that the weapon may so adapt in the usage of the moment that it becomes something different and therefore is problematic from a human involvement point of view. Charlie, any further thoughts?
Yeah, I would second the points that Vincent raised. And in relation to your follow-up question, yes, I think that is one of the issues at hand, is that the idea of a non-deterministic system that will adapt is that it will do so in a way that is presumably intended to be useful in the deployment of the system, but is also adds another element of unpredictability. This is why Vincent brings up the issue of it would presumably have to be, again, tested and evaluated at each point. But it also brings in, aside from issues, so Yasmin brought this up as well, of human dignity and some of the issues that are related around the extent to which it is reasonable, legal, or appropriate to assign some of these tasks or some of these roles to a machine, is also the issue of adversarial action as it comes in to predictability. So we've been talking about a lot of these things generally in the sense of if a system behaves as we expect it to with no other external issue, but we also need to be aware of these are all going to be vulnerabilities presented by these kinds of systems that makes them also vulnerable to adversarial action that can itself then bring in new elements of unpredictability. That ties in also to the point that was raised of, say, a bayonet and the ways that a bayonet might fail. There's a relatively narrow range of ways that a bayonet might fail, and that a person then deploying it could reasonably be expected to anticipate and react to. You may be familiar with some of these examples with self-driving vehicles and so on, where very minor changes in the pattern of stickers that are put on a stop sign or something mean that it's interpreted completely differently by the autonomous vehicle. That's without any adversarial action. You do also then need to consider adversarial action in this context. But we then also add, in addition to the other black box and big if things that we've covered before, that an issue in this context as well is non-state actors from a technological perspective are probably already in a position to use these kinds of systems to meet the kind of requirements that have been brought up to select a target, to engage with a target. The question more on the state side is the extent to which that's possible and to meet the legal requirements and to do so in a way that meets the requirements this committee is discussing. And that's the point I was raising before from the UN side that, from our perspective, has not been demonstrated.
Thank you. Thank you. Yasmin, anything to add?
Yes, so in terms of the first question that you raised, that is fascinating, and you know, how to sort of maintain this meaningful human control in the light of the the adaptable nature of AI, and also how they combine a lot of battlefield data. I think that trickles back to the question of interface, and you know, at the risk of oversimplifying it, when you look at navigational apps on your phone, for example, Google Maps, you say you want to go from point A to point B. The thing is that the software will combine a lot of live data from the traffic, from bus timetables, from incidents, from tube strikes or whatever, and then it will provide you a set of a proposed itinerary. And I think that but then you can play around with the itinerary proposed based on a set of parameters that you have control over. And I think that if we take this analogy for AI systems that for military applications, that if we have the appropriate parameter that will enable the sort of the users to filter out data that they might not necessarily need to know on the first basis, but they still have some control over the parameters and they're able to play around with the outcome, then I think that's a good solution. And echoing Vincent's point on keeping up with tech advances, I think Article 36 legal reviews are useful in terms of assessing the compliance of the systems with the law, but then it doesn't mean that once you've given it the green light, it will always be compliant because of its ever-evolving nature. And that's why I think that, echoing Vincent's point again, the establishment of monitoring and auditing requirements on a constant basis would be a useful step. Whether it would be independently made or not conducted, like the auditing processes, that's another question, because obviously you have the question of industrial secrecy and also the extent to which the systems, like independent parties, can play around with the system because of its inherent coding and obviously again around technical and secrecy considerations. But then obviously you don't want people to mark their own homeworks as well. So that's a consideration, I would say.
I think we are running out of time, and Lord Brown, the clock is against you. Do you want to come in on the
Of course I do.
IHL aspects?
Needless question in some sense. So the questions I want to ask have been, they were anticipated, I think, by the exchange between you, Charlie, and Lord Houghton. So they're about the sufficiency of international humanitarian law to govern, and I'll very carefully watch my language here, Vincent, the use of AWS rather than the AWS themselves, or whether we need other international agreements or accords. And let me just say, as a comment, my inference from the UN Secretary General's remarks were that he was talking about technologies which to me gave the impression that he knew were likely to be developed, rather than just talking in a vacuum, when he was talking about weapon systems that were publicly unacceptable and morally repugnant. So that suggests to me that he, as the leader of the United Nations, believes that this issue of sufficiency is being challenged. So perhaps, Charlie, you could expand upon what you said earlier to start us off on this.
Sure, and I think that interpretation is correct broadly. So and this goes back to the technological question I raised before. So from a purely technological perspective, facial recognition, other technologies around AI do make viable a system that can select a target and then engage it, as in they make it technologically viable. All of the other issues presented and all these other ones we've covered, whether these are from the more ethical side or even just from practical questions around consistency, predictability, training, everything else, call that into question. So the concern from the Secretary General is not that these are far-off technologies or this is a far-off potential application, or that this is something that is being considered as purely a sort of hypothetical in a vacuum, but that we are essentially at this point that some weapon systems that already exist could potentially be argued to exist within this space, whether they are used in that sense or not. And in all cases, we are certainly within the technological threshold of being able to deploy weapon systems that can do some of these things, or all of these things. The question then is the relevance of IHL, which obviously applies, and how we can ensure compliance, both in these senses, and then also some of the questions that come up before about predictability. So there is an understanding, and I believe, especially in the context of the GGE, emerging that any type of weapon that incorporates autonomies into the functions that I've mentioned, so selecting and attacking targets, should be strictly regulated. And these regulations could include limits on things that were brought up before, so targets and locations in which such weapons were used. Whether that comes in the form of an international instrument or some other form is still an open question. But the important point is that international humanitarian law continues to fully apply to all weapon systems, including potential development and use of autonomous weapon systems. We flagged before as well the issue then that such weapons or weapon systems must be able to be traced back to a human element to ensure accountability, and issues of dignity and some of the other questions that come up. I think this committee is probably already familiar with questions like the Martens Clause and the implications of that essentially regardless of the state of the technology, under international humanitarian law, even in situations without an explicit rule, civilians and combatants remain under the protection of principles derived from public conscience. I think the question is not so much, is international humanitarian law sufficient to cover? We've clearly covered lots of examples of the relevance and importance of IHL and international law more generally. It's how do we operationalize that, and what does that mean for the context of this committee? Some of the questions I raised before in the context of Article 36 weapons reviews is to think about what it would mean if compliance cannot be satisfactorily assessed. What does that mean for the development of any of these kinds of systems, or what does that mean for the development of any system that conceivably has some of these technologies or capacities? So I think I would probably just want to underline that element of it, and then I'm happy to pass on.
Perhaps, Yasmin, I mean, I could expand. Can I expand this question, encouraged to do so by you in your first answers, which is beyond the actual weapon system which is deployed for its lethality. I mean, should we expand this to include lethality enabling systems in weapons? And how do we, and what's your view as to whether international humanitarian law as presently applied is sufficient to govern the use of them?
Yeah, so I think that I definitely think that we should be expanding our thinking beyond weapon systems, but also all systems that are lethality enabling. So, for example, when you look at on the other side of the pond in the U.S., there was this revelation from the National Security Agency having a program that collects data from mobile phones in a select parameter, and then based on the data on people's mobile phones, so the location, the call logs, etc., then they would be able to identify an Al-Qaeda courier. And the thing is that it's just based on the routes that the mobile phones are taking, and basically their itinerary route suggests that someone is actually a courier for Al-Qaeda. And when they deployed, when they used the system, they mistakenly identified an Al Jazeera journalist as an Al-Qaeda courier. That kind of system is not a weapon system, but it's lethality enabling, because then if you actually engage the said target, a journalist, that would absolutely be against international humanitarian law considerations. So I would definitely agree that we should be covering these kind of technologies. Whether IHL is sufficient, the thing is that the law is there, and it was designed so as to take into account all forms of warfare, even if its nature is changing. What I'm trying to say here is that even futuristic scenarios would be covered by existing rules, and I would be actually careful in saying that the law is not sufficient, because then it means that, it would imply that there are gaps in the law that people could be exploiting for their own gain, and that would go against the rule of law. But the thing is that those rules are versatile because they are general, and there's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot of clarification that would be needed and would be useful. How it would be done, whether it's through international processes, whether it's through a treaty, whether it's through soft law, because we have also to take into account that it's incredibly difficult to come up with an international treaty, especially now in this geopolitical context. I mean, we can see, for example, in the nuclear sphere, how contentious it was to negotiate the nuclear ban treaty, for example. So, if we take it holistically and take into account hard law instruments and soft law instruments and other processes that would enable this clarification on how the law would apply and be operationalized against the deployment of AI-enabled systems, then I think that would be a really useful first step.
So just one final point. I'm going to ask you this question, Vincent. I mean, although Charlie was the one that encouraged us to look at Article 36 as a key area to look at, so I'm going to ask you if you can engage with this question, right? So I mean, one way of testing whether the existing rules that we have and regulations are sufficient is to look at Article 36. Are you aware of any existing weapons review, of an autonomous system which assessed that system as being autonomous weapons system as being compliant with international humanitarian law? And secondly, I mean, do all those jurisdictions that carry out these Article 36 assessments publish them? I mean, are the public entitled to know what these reviews conclude?
Thank you for the question. We CPRI did quite a lot of work in the past years on the Article 36, especially in the context of emerging technologies and autonomous weapons. The first element to answer your question is that there is no requirement by law for states to disclose the outcome of a legal review, and not that it's, they cannot do it, but most states do not disclose any information. So to my knowledge, I can't report any case of a recent case of like a weapon review of an autonomous weapons. I've heard that there have been weapons that have been reviewed, notably in the US, but I can't, I don't have any, provide any evidence. the only evidence I can say that some of the automated weapons that we have seen today, like the phalanx systems that I mentioned earlier, or the Harpy, most likely have been through these processes before. That's one thing. So we know that there are some weapons that share some characteristic with autonomous weapons that have been deemed lawful in the past through and have passed these processes. And I think one element that is important to note with regard to the value of that process is that it's one critical mechanism to ensure that the weapon can be used in compliance, but it's not the only one. And I want to stress that, you know, the actual legal purpose of Article 36, and I'm going to quote the text, is to determine whether the employment would, in some or all circumstances, be prohibited by the additional protocol and any other rule of international. So I think that's basically the first thing that state will try to do, whether like as states are considering the development or the adoption of a new weapon, whether it's actually something that is already prohibited, whether it is prohibited by any specific weapon treaty, like the Biological Weapon Convention or Chemical Weapon Convention or Blinding Treaty, or any other general rules of international law. And if it's not prohibited, then potentially they can that would pass the review, but most likely the reviewer would also issue some recommendation as with regard to elements to be considered for the lawful use. And these elements, usually this recommendation would be really helpful for then designing the rule of procedure and the rule of engagement specific to that type of weapon. And here I want to note another mechanism that we don't talk often so much about, but it's flowing from Rule 82 about the provision of legal advice. So IHL also demands the provision of legal advice when necessary. That means basically having legal advisors on the side of commanders to kind of help them assess whether the use of a specific weapon in a specific context will be lawful. And I think in the context of autonomous weapons, that's highly important and could be deemed necessary, where the commander would be supported by legal advisors to assess whether at the moment of activation, he can make the assessment that the effect will be lawful or at least not be prohibited.
Thank you very much. Can I ask Lord Fairfax to bring us to a conclusion?
Thank you very much. And with your permission, may I just ask one very quick question to Vincent, arising out of something you said earlier. You drew a distinction, and I think you mentioned phalanx, between offensive and defensive weapons. But is that distinction, in fact, irrelevant because it's very difficult to work out where the dividing line is between an offensive and a defensive question? And then I have if you could just deal with that quickly, and then I have a main question for each of you.
Thanks. No, that's a very good question. I mean, I would agree with you that distinction is not very useful, especially if we are getting into the territory of like, policy making and rule making. It's useful to categorize some of the weapons that are in use today, but obviously defensive weapons can also be used in an offensive way. And how do you categorize the defensive offensive is a very it's not a clear cut division. So I agree with you on that point.
Okay, thank you. And my question for each of you is the same question. What one recommendation would you make to the UK government, if you could make it, in this area?
I think Lord Fairfax may be looking for a one-sentence answer.
Well
done.
I'm going to get it there.
I'm happy to start. I'll keep it in one sentence. The UK has been very active in the conversation in Geneva on autonomous weapons, and especially with regard to kind of pushing for more in-depth discussion on IHL and how IHL actually applies to the development and use of autonomous weapons. And I think that effort that should be commended. And so my recommendation is that the UK should keep supporting this type of effort and ensuring that there is at a substantial level, the discussion is moving forward and trying to provide greater clarity as to how the rules of IHL needs to be interpreted and applied in the context of autonomous weapons, since there are still elements which some respect can be open to very different interpretations. So I think it's a very useful exercise. Thank you.
Charlie?
Well, I'm certainly lucky that I can take that sentence for granted, Ben. So I would say to stress the importance of responsibility throughout the AI lifecycle, including in the civilian space. this kind of development of norms and best practice is something that the UK has been traditionally quite good at. And I mentioned Prince 2 and other program standards that have become international as that background. So given the nature of the technology, we've emphasized the dual use issues, embedding peace and security concerns within normal risk management, mitigation, and so on, in normal AI development practices in civilian and defense situations would be something I would heavily recommend and encourage the UK government to support, especially as this would be building on good practices the UK government has already led on.
And Yasmin, you're speaking to the UK government.
So I would say
Not here, but in the broader sense.
I would suggest being a careful leader in the responsible development of AI. So I would say that focusing, on the upstream stages in the technology's life cycle to promote compliance by design is one recommendation I would stress on. Of course, not to discount the importance of post-deployment stages and across the life cycle of the technology, but I think there's a lot of room for the UK to instill this culture of safety and compliance by design internationally. It can go a long way, especially in the AI field, where unfortunately legal and ethical considerations are more of an afterthought rather than something deeply rooted within the research and development culture from the earliest stages in the technology's life cycle. That would decrease risk from the beginning and would provide space for multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder and inclusive input for the development of these powerful technologies.
Fine. Well, thank you very much indeed. Vincent, au nom de la Commission, merci mille fois pour votre contribution et votre expertise. And to all of you, to Charlie and to Yasmin as well, thank you very much indeed for the time you've spent with us this morning. We've all found it extremely helpful. And as always, we will have various things to follow up as well. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.